Once there was a young man who wanted to get married, but he had a problem meeting young ladies. He generally had a problem with young ladies. So he looked in the yellow pages under matchmaker. He calls up a matchmaker and he tells him his problem. He goes for an interview with the matchmaker, fills out a lot of forms, has an interview, tells the matchmaker what kind of a woman he's looking for. He goes home, and the next day the matchmaker calls him and says to him, tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, it's arranged for you to meet this young lady, and she's everything you've ever wanted. So the young man is very happy, and he goes to work. He comes back from work, and he's thinking about his date the next night, and he can't sleep. He's so worried he can't sleep. So after spending a sleepless night, he waits till 9 o'clock when the matchmaker's office opens, and he calls him up and he says, "I can't go through with it. I don't know what to do. I told you I'm not very good with young ladies." The matchmaker, of course, thinking about his fee, says to the young man, "Well, what's the problem? What's your problem with young ladies?" He says, "Well, I never know what to talk about. When I meet somebody new, I never know what to say." So the matchmaker says to him, "Look, here's my advice. First thing you want to do is you want to create a romantic environment. So the first thing you should do is talk about love." So the young man writes down on a piece of paper, "Love." The matchmaker says, "And after you've set this romantic environment and talked about love, if you're interested in the young lady, you want to know something about her background, something about her family. So talk about family." So he writes down family. And the matchmaker says, "And if you're really interested, you want to see what virtues she has, you want to see how intelligent she is. So talk about philosophy." So he writes down philosophy. The young man says, "Oh, now I feel better. Now I feel relaxed. Now I know what to do." So he takes a nap. And at 7 o'clock, he's all dressed. He's outside of his house. And a long limousine sent by this young lady pulls up to his door. He gets in. They drive out to the suburbs, and they go through a gate, and they're driving about 10 minutes through the gate till they come to a big mansion. And he gets out of the limousine and he rings the doorbell, and this young lady opens the door, and she's everything he ever hoped for. She's just right out of his dreams. The butler ushers them through the many rooms till they come to a big dining room, a big chandelier, long table. She's sitting at one end of the table, he's sitting at the other end of the table. There are butlers and waiters all around, violins softly playing in the background, and he's in heaven. Everything he could possibly think of. And they're serving the meal. And they're ready up to the soup. And he hasn't said a word except hello. So he's afraid he's going to lose her. So he looks in his pocket, he has this paper with those 3 words. So they're eating, and she's talking to the butler for a minute, and he looks, love, love. He says, "What can I say about love?" He looks across the table at her. She's so beautiful, he's almost speechless. He starts thinking, love, what can I say about love? Finally, he leans forward in his chair and he says to her, "You know, I just love matzo ball soup." She says, "I guess it's okay." I serve the salad, the appetizer. At the end of the main course, they haven't said anything else to each other. He's panicking. He's afraid he's going to lose her. And he looks again in his paper. Sees family. Family. What can you say about family? Better think fast or he'll lose her. Finally, he looks across the table, very determined, and he says to her, "Tell me, your brother, does he like matzo ball soup?" And she says, "I don't have a brother." And now they're already serving dessert. It's almost time for him to leave. He might lose everything. He has one word left. She drops her napkin. When the butler goes to pick it up, she retrieves it, and then he looks in his pocket and he sees the third word, philosophy. What's he going to say? It's his last chance. He's thinking and thinking. And finally he looks across the table at her and he says, "Tell me. If you had a brother, would he like matzo ball soup?" So these are the three issues we have to discuss in terms of Jewish family values: love, family, philosophy. So let me begin that discussion with a quote from Tolstoy in his great novel, Anna Karenina. The first line in Anna Karenina, you know what it is? It's a very famous line.
Unhappy families.
Pardon me?
All happy families are the same. You're unhappy when you
Close. Very close. Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Now, what I suggest is that the criteria for determining whether a family is unhappy or whether a family is dysfunctional depends upon how we view the nature and function of family life to begin with. Because to say it's dysfunctional, unhappy, means it doesn't quite meet a certain criteria that we have for it. So let me give you some examples of this. One example, which is of great concern in the Jewish community today, is the high rate of intermarriage, which is somewhere between, according to most sociologists, 48 and 52%. Now, why are people in the Jewish community, or some people, disturbed about this? Because they assume that one of the criteria for the functioning Jewish family is that the family serves as a vehicle for the continuity of a tradition, in this case, Jewish tradition. If they didn't assume this, and if they didn't see intermarriage as a problem where this is concerned, they wouldn't be upset. So what I'm saying is, how you evaluate the functioning of a family assumes that you have certain criteria for how it should function. Or, for example, in the Middle Ages, say in Maimonides' view of the family is drawn, or is influenced, I would say, not drawn, from Aristotle. That view was that the family is the smallest political unit. That the family is like the microcosm of bigger political units like a city or like a country. And that if the smaller units that make up the bigger unit, sort of if the bricks that make up the wall are fragile, then the wall is fragile. In other words, that in order for a society to be stable, society being the big political unit, the macro political unit, that the micro political units, namely the family, have to function well. And then the question is, what means function well? And that's where you have differences of opinion, because very often that's where you get into the idea that each part of the family unit has a prearranged or predefined role within the family. Like in the song you all know from Fiddler on the Roof, tradition. This is what the father does, this is what the mother does, this is what the children do. If you're going to say the family is dysfunctional because each member of the family is not fulfilling their role, that assumes they already have a role. And you have to make a decision whether it's a role that is desirable. And that's a very loaded issue today. Some argue that the family is essentially an economic unit, say, rather than a political unit or a social unit. That it's a unit in society that both produces and consumes. And in the last century, in an agrarian society where everybody is working, say, in a farm, if the family wasn't functional, in other words, if every part of the family wasn't doing the divided labor that they have, they would really be in big trouble, because their very survival was dependent upon it. And today you have to ask the question, if by family you mean the traditional nuclear family, or do you mean some kind of non-traditional or alternative family type? Because if your model is the traditional nuclear family, and most families or many families are not in that model, then your conclusion is inevitably that the family is dysfunctional. But if your operating assumption is that the model is not necessarily the nuclear traditional family, then the fact that we have many of them does not necessarily lead you to the conclusion that the family is dysfunctional.
What is the nuclear?
Nuclear family generally means father, mother, of opposite sex, and
2.5 children.
something like this. Now, to make the situation more problematic within not only the general community, but certainly within the Jewish community, I would say that in the Jewish community there has been a tendency to over-idealize the model of the Jewish family that was thought to exist in the past, but which does not really stand up to rigorous historical analysis. In other words, people very often say the Jewish family now is breaking down, and it's never been like this before, and in the past it's always been wonderful. You've heard this. But if you look into it more closely, you see it hasn't always been wonderful in the past. Let me give you some examples. One example is that one historian did a study simply of census rolls in Jewish neighborhoods, mostly in New York. During the years right after the great waves, or during the great waves of immigration between, say, 1890 and the First World War. And what they found, and they also did a study of the records of Jewish social service organizations. And what they deduced from the data was a very high level of spousal desertion by Jewish men of their wives and children. Both in terms of men who came over here while leaving the families in Europe and starting new families here and leaving the other families, and in terms of desertion when they married here. And according to one historian, the rate could have been as high, say in around 1900, 1910, as 25%, or 1 in every 4 Jewish families. So the ideal, at least when we're talking about that generation, doesn't seem to correlate with the data. Secondly, I've been reading lately rabbinic research of rabbinic literature on the whole question of spousal abuse. And the fact that we can identify responsa, or Jewish case law, in which issues of spousal abuse are raised, shows that the idea that Jews never experience spousal abuse is a myth. Or, third example is the portrayal, depiction of the Jewish family in American Jewish literature. Say in the works of people like Roth, Bellow, Malamud, the sort of 3 best-known Jewish writers from the 40s and 50s. They didn't make all this up. So when they write, for example, about the very strong, overbearing Jewish mother and the impotent, constipated Jewish father, paralleling very often the breadwinning Jewish mother of the immigrant generation and the unemployed Jewish father, this isn't totally made up. It certainly reflected some reality that was going on here. And the fourth example, you might find a little, maybe even shocking or strange, and that is that if you read works by, say, sociologists or social workers and police reports, say, of the immigrant generation, say, on the Lower East Side in the 1890s and early decades of the 20th century, 2 very bizarre things you encounter there, seen from our perspective looking back. One is this idea, and you find it, the Commissioner of New York Police Department, Bingham, I think his name was, said it in around 1910 in a press conference. The Jews are a major criminal element. The Jews are mostly criminals. Certainly there was a lot of crime going on. There's a Jewish historian in New York who has come to the conclusion there is only one sort of unique type of American Jew, or Jew created in America, and that was the American Jewish criminal. All the other types they had in Europe. But in America... Pardon me? What AJC?
American Jewish criminal.
Oh, well, it happens to be that this historian works for the AJC, the American Jewish Committee, but...
Shachar talked about that.
Pardon me?
Shachar talked about that in his book, History of Jews in America.
Well, many people have talked about it. There was a book published some years ago by University of Indiana Press called Our Gang. It was supposed to be the parallel to the book about the rich German Jewish magnates called Our Crowd. And this was about the development of the Jewish crime syndicates. So they had one chapter, for example, on Murder Incorporated, which were almost all Jews, and one chapter on Arnold Rothstein, who, you know, fixed the World Series and is probably the basis for Gatsby and The Great Gatsby by Fitzgerald, and the people who joined with the Italians to start the mafia, who were eventually overtaken by the Italians, like Mayor Lansky and these other guys. So there's something to this. And the other thing you find in this literature, which really sounds strange today for us, is They said, Jews have a natural talent for basketball. Because when they were in New York, in the schoolyards, I mean, what could you play? Handball and basketball. You didn't have money for baseball gloves. So the Jewish family, I would say, whatever it was, is not necessarily what we might think it was, and therefore to compare the situation today against some kind of idealized myth, and on the basis of that to say it's more dysfunctional now than it was then, may not be completely fair. The final point I want to make tonight is simply to tell you what sort of the coming attractions. I want to deal with this issue of the Jewish family values by focusing on 4 sub-issues. The first is the issue of marriage. If you look into sources in Jewish literature, what is the purpose of marriage? The second issue I want to deal with is the issue of parent-child relations. Not only in terms of the child's obligation to the parents, which are very clearly stated in the Ten Commandments, but what does it mean to honor? But also the question of the parent's relation to the child. One of the Ten Commandments deals with the child's relation to the parents, but none of them deals with the parent's relation to the child. What do we have in the literature on that? And this issue is sort of amplified when you consider the fact that if you read the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, most of the people in there who we revere for all kinds of things were lousy parents. I'll give you the whole, a whole litany next week, but you can think of all the biblical characters you know or have read about. Almost all of them were lousy parents, so we really don't find any great role models, or too many great role models in the Bible, and therefore we have to look elsewhere in subsequent Jewish sources for some enlightenment on that. Then the third issue I want to discuss is the issue of love. What is it? And the fourth issue is the issue of sexuality, which will bring us also into a discussion of attitudes toward the body in Jewish sources. At our last meeting, I introduced you a topic which I'm calling Jewish family values, with a story that some of you may remember. And then with some reflections on examining expectations for Jewish family life based on various definitions or understandings of the nature and functions of the family. Now I want to move to a discussion of the 4 parts of this topic that I'm calling Jewish family values, introduced last week, and the 4 parts of the discussion that I want to focus on are topics. Topic 1, marriage in Jewish tradition. Topic 2, love. 3, sexuality. And 4, parent-child relations. This, in my view, are the 4 central issues when you're talking about Jewish family values. So first, a few things about Jewish views of marriage. I won't discuss the marriage ceremony, that's another course. The first point, and I think most visceral point to make, is that in Jewish tradition, marriage is considered a desirous state. This means that it is not, as, say, in Christian sources, considered to be a compromise. In Jewish sources, it is considered to be a fulfillment of a commandment. And when I mean a compromise, I'm referring to the well-known statement by St. Paul in his letter to the Corinthians, chapter 7, verse 1, where he says, "It is well for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid sin, let every man have his wife, and each man have her husband. I say this by way of concession, but it is better to remain celibate like me. That's St. Paul. In other words, the Christian view is that celibacy is the desirable state, and marriage is an undesirable, sort of a necessary evil. Jewish view is that marriage is a desirous state, a sanctified state, a commanded state. And let me give you sort of the, if you would make sort of a spectrum here, let me give you the romantic side of the spectrum, because it was in the Torah reading, I think, 2 weeks ago. We discussed here last week, somebody asked a question about this tradition that Isaac was really killed. Remember we discussed this last week? So the Midrash commentaries asked the question, if he was killed by Abraham at Mount Moriah, then how could he be marrying Rebecca 2 chapters later, right? If he's dead. So the answer the Midrash gives is that God resurrected him because the state of being married, particularly to Rebecca, was a greater bliss even than being in paradise. That's the romantic side of the spectrum. Whether it's true, that's your decision. Now, the second idea we have is the idea of marriage as the fulfillment of the person, of the individual. And I want to spend a minute or two on this because it's very important for reasons that will become apparent in a minute, which those of you who are in the feminist camp should find interesting, even those of you who aren't. I want to refer to 2 verses in Genesis that are relevant to this. The first is Genesis 2:24, which says, Al ken ya'azov ish et aviv ve'et imo v'davak b'ishto v'hayu levasar echad. Means, therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and cleave to his wife, and they shall be like one flesh. So here you have the idea that 2 people become as one. The second verse is in Genesis 5:2, chapter 5, verse 2, which says, Zachar u'nekeva, male and female, bar'am. He, namely God, created them. Vayevarech otam, and he blessed, God blessed them. Vayikra shemam, and he called their name Adam. Biyom hibaram, in the day that he, namely God, created them. So the rabbis asked the question, how come there is this shift back and forth from the singular to the plural? In other words, how come it says, male and female he created them, and he blessed them, and he called their name Adam? Should be, he called his name Adam, right? So you have this one verse that says they become one flesh, like one body. And you have this other verse that they, namely the man, the male, and the female, are called by the name Adam. How come the male and the female, who are male and female, are called by the name Adam? And here in the Midrash Genesis Rabbah, you have the following story told. You have a similar story in Plato, but I'm not going to get here into Plato, into his dialogue, the Symposium, but I'm not going to get into this distinction between the two. And here's the story. They use in the Midrash here the Greek word androgynous. I can't spell, as you know, something like that.
A-N-D-R-O.
Pardon me?
A-N-D-R-O.
D-R-O. G.
D-R-O.
I always add letters. Androgynous, and it says in the Midrash, Adam androgynous haya. Adam was an androgynous. Adam was bisexual. In other words, the way this Midrash reads the text of the creation of Adam, Adam wasn't a man. Adam was male and female in one person. One half was male and one half was female. That was Adam.
That is God's image.
God's image. Kabbalists, that's next quarter, took up this idea. Now,
Is that being bisexual or bigendered?
both.
Yeah.
Hermaphrodite, both. One half is male, one half is female. And when you have that verse where it says, God made a deep sleep to fall on Adam, and he took from Adam the tselah, they translate the word tselah as side. If you look at Rashi, it's very clear. He says, tselah, tzad, side. In other words, in this view, God didn't simply take out a rib. This was in the Vulgate, St. Jerome's Latin translation of the Bible, made it rib. But here, the Jewish view here was that the first human being, Adam, was bisexual. And the creation of woman wasn't simply that he took out one little bone and put some stuff on it and said, poof, that's the woman, but rather that God split this Adam, who was originally hermaphrodite, male and female together, into two parts, a male part and a female part. So in this view, it's not that the woman is derivative from the man, it's rather that the two are part of the same thing. And this is where the expression you have, even in English, you talk about my other half, comes from. That the idea is that when the male and female come together, particularly in marriage, it is not simply a unification into one flesh, but it's a reunification. It's bringing things back to the way they were in the beginning, before the split. So this is the idea that the goal is to be one, and it's a reconstitution of an original oneness. So in this view, one of the goals or functions of marriage or characteristics of marriage is fulfillment, self-fulfillment by finding the other half. Then the third idea you have is that, let me put it another way. I mentioned to a number of times that in dealing with almost all Jewish concepts, you have this notion of a polarity, of two complementary opposites. And with regard to marriage, you have the polarity between law and love. So you see, for example, the Jewish marriage contract, called in Hebrew ketubah. This is a contract, so it's a legal document, so it's law. Has all the characteristics of a legal document. But it's not like a lease on an apartment. In other words, it is a symbol of something more than simply a legal agreement. So you have this polarity of law and of love. You have this polarity in the marriage of a legal agreement or a contract, and also of something sacred. The Hebrew word for marriage is kiddushin, which comes from the root kadosh, meaning holy. Or to put it another way, the way the rabbis put it, if you have the Hebrew word ish, and then you have the word Isha, okay? You don't have to know Hebrew to see what's going on here. You look at the letters. This is the same, right? This is the same. So what are you left with? You're left with this and this. And this is the abbreviation for God. In other words, when the man and the woman come together, you have the divine. So here you have the idea of sanctity. Now, the fourth characteristic isn't universally accepted. And that's why I have to say a few things about it. And that is marriage as monogamy. As you know, in the Bible already, they had polygamy. Now, do you know when monogamy sort of came in as the more or less standard thing in Jewish life? All right. Yeah, what did Rabbi Gershon, Light of the Exile, do?
He promulgated a law.
That?
And now
No, it wasn't a response.
It wasn't about the monogamy was a derivative from what the problem he was responding to. Wasn't the word. He was responding to a woman's right to inherit or something like that.
Well, let's not get to what raised it. Let's just get to what he said. He made a promulgation, as you said, legislative promulgation called in Hebrew takana. This is not a response, a community promulgation, which was that, pardon me? His name was Rabbeinu Gershon. He lived in what is today Germany. He is known by the title, if you like, Light of the Exile. He was, I think, in the, 10th century, something like this. 9th, 10th century.
Is Rabbeinu a first name or is it a title?
It's a title, our master. It's a very high title, higher than rabbi. I mean, he was really a big shot. And they made a community decree that there should only be monogamy. Now, here are the problems with it. First, I'm not getting to it expired yet. First, in the Talmud, there is not one example of a rabbi mentioned in the Talmud, or as far as I know anybody else mentioned in the Talmud, who was polygamous. So it means that there was already a custom of monogamy already then. Now, when Rabbeinu Gershon made his decree, he made it for a period of 500 years, so it's already run out a long time ago, and he made it only for the Ashkenazic Jewish community. Ashkenaz in Hebrew does not mean a delicatessen. In Chicago it means Germany. In the Bible, Ashkenaz is probably Germany. In other words, it was not binding on the Sephardic community. And in the Sephardic community, the custom remained of having more than one wife. And today, in certain Sephardic communities that are still operating, say like in Iran, where there are still some Jews left, there's still polygamy going on there. So if you're interested in polygamy, move to Tehran.
What was the motivation for one wife to get? I mean, they had many.
Well, that's the question. What was the motivation? The situation was that already in his place, in his time, monogamy was already established. When he made this promulgation, this takana, he was attacked on the grounds that he was following what is called in Jewish law the Chukat HaGoy, Gentile practice. He was attacked on the grounds that he was bringing into Judaism a practice that was a Christian practice. Because the patriarchs were polygamous, and because the Sephardic Jews were polygamous. But his position held So what I'm saying is, this is the model that has come down to us, but it's not the only model we have. The other point has to do with another kind of marriage that is now being discussed around today, which Jewish law eliminated as a possibility within Judaism in about the 2nd century, and that is homosexual marriage. In other words, marriage of two people of the same sex. Now, you know, there's this business in Hawaii that they want to bring to other states, and the Congress said no, and all this business. That marriage means, as the new law passed by the Congress says, we have the same view, marriage means the marriage between a male and a female. So in other words, they already had considered this issue back in the 2nd century because it was very common, very popular in the Greco-Roman world, and they rejected it as an option. It's not like they never considered it. They already considered it.
The Reconstruction is kind of trying to ignore that question.
Well, there is some movement in the Reform Rabbinate and some of the Reconstructionist Rabbinate to perform same-sex marriages, but it's not recognized legally by the state and is considered illegal to perform. So, I mean, what does it mean?
Well, it's staying within our own community. The state doesn't care much about kosher food.
No. This is a different issue. For example, do you know it's illegal to perform a religious wedding? Per se. It's illegal.
In Illinois?
In most states.
Has to be
It has to also be a secular wedding. So in other words, the clergyman acts as the agent of the state when they perform the wedding, and they're performing the religious ceremony which the state doesn't care anything about, but is acting as the agent of the state. So it is illegal for a clergyman to marry somebody only in a religious ceremony and say, you know, you're married, if it is not also sanctioned by the state. An exception to the rule would be, and I've done it myself, if people are already married by the state. Say you have a situation of a couple where they got married, one isn't Jewish, and they're married, you know, by a judge. And then later one of them, the one that's not Jewish, converts, and they want a religious marriage. So you can marry them, not by power of the state, because they're already married. Then it's not illegal. But if you say to them, you're married, but we don't recognize the state, that's illegal. And the same would be true of a same-sex marriage. They can perform any ceremony they want, but it is not recognized by the state, so it's an illegal marriage. And I'm sure that somebody will do it, and they'll have a test case and all this. But right now it's illegal. And I'm not getting in here into the question, you know, of homosexuality. That's another issue altogether. There was a case in New York on Long Island last year of a woman rabbi in a Reform synagogue who sent out an invitation to her congregants to come to her ufruf. That's the celebration the Saturday before the wedding. So they were all happy that the rabbi, this woman rabbi, she was an assistant rabbi in a very big congregation, was getting married. So they all came to the ufruf, and then she announces that it's an ufruf in honor of her having a commitment ceremony with her lesbian partner the next week. And it caused a tremendous uproar in this congregation, as you can imagine. Partially, mostly amongst parents in the congregation who had teenage daughters and looked at her as a role model. So this is going to be in the open now more and more. It's going to be a bigger and bigger issue now, more and more. Yeah.
Maybe actually back up, because I think I missed the first motivation for the decree. I just reviewed that.
The first motivation isn't really clear. It may be an issue of inheritance. My view is it wasn't an issue of inheritance. I mean, I know there are people who make this argument. My guess is that somebody moved up to Germany from the Sephardic countries.
Okay.
And they wanted to have more than one wife, or they had more than one wife, and, you know, so it's like that cartoon, there ought to be a law. I must say, though, that the Israeli courts handled the issue of polygamy much more intelligently than the American courts. In 48, when Israel was established as a country, and say Yemenite Jews started coming to Israel and they had more than one wife. Usually they had one older one and one younger one, like the Mormons. The Israeli government said, if you come with more than one, you can keep the ones you have, but you can't have any more. And eventually, the issue died out. The American courts, beginning already with the famous case, the Reynolds case in 1862, said you can only have one, and if you have more than one, you got to get rid of one, or leave the country. So many of the Mormons went to Mexico. Some, told the government that one was their daughter. So, if they got caught, they were really in trouble. And it was really stupid. And if you read the case, it's even more stupid because the case says polygamy is like an offense to the public morality. And then they give an analogy. The analogy they give is the sacrifice of the Aztecs of a virgin, where they would take a woman and, while she was alive, cut open her chest and pull out her heart and give it to the Aztec god. They said, this is what polygamy is like. And this is U.S. Supreme Court decision. So I think that we handled it in this country in a very stupid way. And in Israel, for once, they handled something in a rather intelligent way. Because the issue has already is passé. Now, if all of a sudden large numbers of Jews start coming from Iran with many wives, it would be another story. But that's the issue. Now, I'd like to suggest to you that in Jewish literature, we find six purposes for the formation of a family through marriage. The first is, as I mentioned, that it's considered a religious activity. It's a mitzvah. The second, which I already mentioned, is that it's the fulfillment of the person. This is why, even though we have had over the centuries ascetic practices in Judaism, we never opted for celibacy. The main ascetic practice you find in Jewish history is fasting. The main ascetic practice you find in Christianity is celibacy. We never took the option of celibacy because marriage was considered a religious activity, a mitzvah, and was considered the fulfillment of the person. The biblical verse puts it simply, it is not good for the man to be alone. The third purpose is the propagation of the species. In other words, the first commandment in the Torah of the supposedly 613 commandments is what? Be fruitful and multiply. So this is one of the purposes of marriage, the propagation of the species. The fourth purpose is companionship. In the Talmud, in the tractate Yevamot, page 2b, it says, a person who lives without a spouse lives without joy, lives without blessing, and lives without good. In other words, pardon me?
I'm sorry, without joy?
Without joy, without blessing, without good. In other words, the idea is that companionship itself is enough of a motive. Let me put it another way. If you have the view that the only or the primary purpose of marriage is propagation of the species, then would marriage between two people beyond the age of bearing children be permitted? No, it wouldn't. And you have certain Christian traditions in the Middle Ages that people, say, who widowed after the age of childbearing did not remarry. Here the idea is that because companionship is the primary thing, that it overrides the reason of propagation of the species, because companionship itself is an end in itself as a reason. A fifth purpose is, and this relates to something we discussed last week, that the family is the smallest political unit, and that for society to work, the family must work. That the family, which is formed through the marriage, is like the individual bricks that constitute the wall being the entire society. And if the bricks aren't working, then the wall will fall down. And this is a very common view in medieval Jewish philosophy, particularly in writers like Gersonides, less so Maimonides, but it's a view that derives probably from Aristotle. And then the sixth and final purpose is the idea that the family is the vehicle for the perpetuation of the tradition. That without the family functioning, the tradition would have no vehicle to be passed down to the future. And this will relate to an issue we'll discuss hopefully next week, and that is the major job description of the Jewish parent. The major job description of the Jewish parent is the idea of the parent as pedagogue, the parent as teacher, and the family as the vehicle whereby the traditions are passed down into the future. And this you have, for instance, in the first paragraph in the Shema, which is in the book of Deuteronomy, right? You should teach them your children diligently. And this is the whole purpose of the most commonly practiced Jewish ritual, and that is the Passover Seder. Seder, the text of the Seder is the Haggadah. Haggadah means the telling, and it's in fulfillment of the commandment, you should tell your child the story. In other words, you should pass down the story, you should pass down the tradition. So the family becomes the vehicle for, to use the current jingo word, Jewish continuity. So these are the six characteristics, purposes of the family. And then next week we'll begin on a romantic note, by discussing love, then sexuality, then parent-child relations, and then loving the neighbor as themselves.